Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Skwawk Talk on Socialist Telly. And I'm delighted to be joined by two esteemed councillors from Liverpool, Councillor Anna Rothery, former Lord Mayor, and Councillor Alan Gibbons, along with my colleague Damien Willey from Socialist Telly. In 1987, 47 Labour councillors said when their city tried to, when the government tried to impose a massive budget cut on the city, they said it's better to break the law than to break the poor, and they risked going to prison. They were surcharged for the difference in the budget, etc. And it saw in the end a massive surge in the support for the Labour Party. We're in a similar situation now in that there is a massive cuts budget being forced on the city, but in this case, some of the people who are doing the forcing are the Labour establishment, and the city has commissioners brought in, imposed on it by the government at huge cost, and we'll go into that during the show. Keir Starmer's official stance on that is that he thinks it's a brilliant thing that those people have been imposed on a Labour city, which is perverse in the extreme. But the mayor and the council leadership seem to be towing that line and being fully cooperative, let's say, with the commissioners and their plans for cuts in the city, which will impact heavily on some of the poorest people in Liverpool. So far, 6 councillors have said that they are going to ignore the Labour whip to vote for that budget, and they're going to vote against it. Because they can't bring themselves and can't do it in good conscience to vote for cuts that are going to hit people so hard. So those guys are putting themselves in the same bracket there as the 47 or something of a legend in Liverpool. And yet again, we have a Labour authority doing anything but cover itself in glory in terms of how it's behaving for the people of the city. So welcome onto the show. Don't forget you can contribute into the show and participate through the comments on Facebook and YouTube. It doesn't work on Twitter as yet, sadly, but we will field your comments and questions as we go through the show as well. We're going to try and shed a little bit of light on what's going on, and the possibility also that ex-Labour councillors, if the party decides to expel people for standing up for principle, could end up being largest or second largest opposition group on the council. So welcome, Anna. Do you want to kick us off in terms? You've already left the party, just to be clear to people so they understand what's going on. You quit in disgust a while ago. Do you want to give us a bit of background on that first, and let people know where you are in terms?
Well, I mean, I've been a Labour councillor for 16 years, so probably one of the elder councillors or longest serving councillors in terms of the Peel City Council. You know, it's been a very difficult time politically. You know, we've seen great changes within the Labour Party. And people are probably, it's no secret, I ran for elected mayor because I felt as though that, you know, even in a short period of time, it needed some strong leadership who would take the city in the direction that we needed to go. I was unsuccessful with that, and people are probably aware of that. But, you know, I just couldn't, under, you know, the Labour government nationally and locally now, remain a Labour councillor. Because for me, you know, the Labour Party bears very little resemblance to the party that I joined as a teenager. And so I made a huge decision, and I didn't do it, it didn't come easy, but I made the decision some 7 months ago to go independent as a socialist councillor. The one thing I will say is all the years that I've been an elected member in Liverpool, I've never been silenced before. I've always been able to speak, you know, my truth to power. And, you know, I'm literally being allowed to do that. Under this new administration and this new regime, it's really difficult to be open and honest about, you know, or even have any debate about the big issues. You know, I felt as though all debate has been silenced. There were so many caveats being put into play in terms of suspension, you know, being threatened with expulsion, you know, going through disciplinary action, and just the mere treatment of our elected members. And for me, that's a direct assault on the people that we're elected to represent, because we are here at the end of the day to serve the people who put us in the positions. So any disrespect or threats or, cajoling to make us change our minds is a direct threat to the people who've actually elected us. And so I knew we would end up with a difficult choice this year in terms of cuts. But I also knew that over the years that we've been, over the last 10 years, when we've had cuts implemented, we said a long time ago that there is a time when we have to say no more cuts. And that time is now. And so by leaving the party, I was able to explore some of the options. And, there are options in place in terms of investor save. There's dividends available. We shouldn't be implementing any cuts. And I just want to, quash the narrative in terms of what's being put out there in terms of the Labour Party. With the greatest respect to the 47 and the work that they did, the Labour Party is basically trying to say that the people within the Labour Party and the independents are trying to set an illegal budget. And we're not doing that. So I just want to be very clear about that. The options that have been put forward are non-illegal budgets. They're fully thought out, fully costed out, and we can do it based on the dividends that we already have, that we've got secured in the city. So we shouldn't be implementing any cuts in the city whatsoever. And so that's
let's go into that in a bit more detail later on. If we can, I'll just get Alan's kind of introductory bit really as to where he is, and then we'll come on to some of the detail in terms of what the council is planning to do, and what those who are resisting it say should be done instead. So, Alan, you got your suspension notification just before the programme, if I understand correctly. So give us a little bit about your position there now.
Yeah, obviously I'm a new councillor, elected May the 7th. My trajectory is I was kind of strong-armed by members of Liverpool Walton CLP. If you cast your mind back, one of the bodies that was most responsible for attacking Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and trying to sabotage it was a large number of councillors. I think 800 wrote a letter to try and get Jeremy Corbyn out. So we needed allies within local government for Jeremy, and I agreed to do it. Then, of course, along came COVID, a whole series of things. By the time I actually took my seat, we had Keir Starmer in office, and much of the reason that I'd become a councillor had gone. But I thought, what the heck, let's try to rescue the best we can. Let's keep the socialist flame alive. If there's ever to be a resurgence of the left in the Labour Party, stick on in there and try to do my best. One of the things that really started to demoralise me was at every stage, we were raising that the ACC arms fair was obscene, and we just kept we hit this wall of legal advice. Eventually, and it didn't get much publicity, 14 Labour councillors were prepared to back a Green amendment, and there was a whole lot of kerfuffle, and then the legal advice came in, you're ruling this motion out of order. And then come the cuts, and the cuts were affecting areas that I really care about: social care, libraries, SEND provision. And I thought the green bins was, if you wanted to do an own goal and shoot yourself in the foot, when we've just agreed that we don't want basically the airport expansion and we want to take zero carbon seriously, to make a charge for green bins just sounded crazy. Yeah. And the other thing I should put into the mix is, of course, I've been suspended before because as secretary at the time of Liverpool Walton CLP, I put a motion that Jeremy Corbyn should be reinstated, and was suspended for that. And I mean, I consider that one of the most authoritarian and iniquitous things to happen in the Labour movement in recent years. Together with the cuts, which is the focus for those of us who have rebelled, if you want to put it that way, it is this growing authoritarianism and restriction of free speech. And that is the Labour movement has always been one of the foremost bodies fighting for free speech. I thought the green bins was, if you wanted to do, I don't know what that was. I hope that's not David Evans, but sorry, mate.
Well, he's welcome on if he wants to justify it. Try
They
and
were
justify
kind of
some of what
three
he's done.
streams, confluences, all affecting my decision. I mean, the last thing I want to say is nobody should ever feel querulous and afraid when you get these letters. I mean, you know, we're all consenting adults. I'm a big boy, I'm 68. And if I decide to break the whip on principle, I expect to get this letter. Am I quaking in my boots? No, absolutely not. There's a life beyond the Labour Party if I end up outside it, and I suspect I will.
I was going to ask you on that, actually, Alan, because having followed your social media for a long time now, you've been one of the most vocal Labour voices for staying in, stay and fight. And of course, as you rightly say, the party has become more and more authoritarian, more and more difficult to just suck it up and swallow what's getting dished out at us. Do you still feel it's best to stay and fight for some people, or do you think perhaps there is, as you just said, more to life outside of the Labour Party going forwards now, given the direction it's taking?
I mean, I think it's absolutely legitimate to stay in, and I'll still pay my sub to Momentum to support its efforts. I'll still cooperate with the good socialist comrades inside the Labour Party. It is going to be very much a matter now of debate and suck it and see. What I would say is, whether you're inside or outside of the Labour Party, you're facing one of the greatest challenges in recent years. If you're inside the Labour Party, you've got to prove that the prospect of eventually recovering the party for the left and making a mass democratic socialist party is viable. If you're outside, you have got to prove that it is viable to try and pull together the many disparate and warring sections of the outside left into a credible alternative. So the whole of the left is facing challenges. I don't think that's surprising, because if you're on the objective circumstances of economic crisis, of the decline in public participation, means that it plunges all competing ideas into crisis. And so it's whoever steps up and is able to meet those challenges deserves to have the leadership of the Labour movement.
Yeah, completely concur with that.
So let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty in terms of where these cuts are going to fall, because obviously the budget hasn't been published as yet. So Anna, what have you seen that's going to be hit, and who's going to be affected by it?
I mean, you know, we have to take it in context, Steve. I mean, we're talking about a city that's already on its knees. I mean, we've got some of the highest level of child poverty, in-wage poverty, than any of the cities, you know, nationally. So we're starting from ground zero anyway here. So then to start cutting things like libraries, which are now in community centres, and that would enticed into that arrangement by, you know, being promised that they will be supported. You know, now we're looking at libraries having to start bidding for funding through mainstream funding, which basically means we know the state of play in terms of accessing funding now. Objective One's gone. You know, all the big funds that were around historically have totally disappeared. And so in terms of people being able to access services to support them in terms of benefits, housing benefits, access to doctors, so on and so forth, we know the not-for-profit sector picks up a large part of the injustice in cities. You know, we always have historically. You know, we might be there to do a specific job or a specific project, but we don't turn anybody away from the door. And so, you know, it was a natural sort of progression to encourage the organisations to do the work that they do, because they've got their ear to the ground. They know where the difficulties are, and they know how to access people who are in need. So now what we've had introduced is that they're now going to have to go into a bidding round for funding to carry on the work that they've been doing historically. And so they haven't, you know, it's not as if you can't even say that they've left them in a bad place. They've left them in a worse place than what they started off. Because before this intervention from the council, you know, there was autonomy there. They had their funders that they could access, and they had that kind of coherent kind of relationship with potential funders. That may disappear. And that's going to mean that hundreds and thousands of people who need to access services will have no way of doing that.
Yeah, that also goes on with the one-stop shops, which have been slashed right back as well, with taking away people's access, particularly if they're not well set up in terms of internet access and so on as well. Alan, what's the social services impact on this?
Well, I mean, social care is taking the biggest hit. So when you change criteria, make it more difficult for people to get social care packages, that is going to materially affect a lot of families. Now, at the Finance and Mayoral Joint Select Committee, which was the last time to scrutinise, myself and Councillor Alfie Hinks were asking questions about the impact assessment. And to be honest, we didn't really get an answer, because it was said that because they're all individual packages, you can't give an impact assessment. Well, I think that's incredibly flawed thinking. If you put a figure of getting on for 10 million for the overall universal cut and 2 million for the immediate cuts, I mean, that have been mentioned a lot in the press as being the most critical, if you want, then of course you've got to have an impact assessment. Otherwise, on what basis are you deciding to put amounts to these things? And as Anna said, when we come to the libraries, one of the key things was in 2014, when I was having right old ding-dongs with Mary Simon and Joe Anderson at meetings, we were actually told that these non-council libraries were the solution to trying to maintain some element of a universal service. Well, we can't say that historically and then say they've got to year on year have the uncertainty of making competitive tendering bids for pots of money. That just means permanent insecurity. I think you have to say, if you say libraries are a universal service, and that's what the Act said, then you have to guarantee their future. And there are issues over the green bins, as I said before, and send transport. And there's all sorts of little things throughout. And one of the things that worries you, when you take a look at the amounts, there's always this figure next to it is to review things. But if you can put an amount of money next to a review, it's a cut. It's not a review, it's not a saving, it's a cut. And it's death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, you just think, anybody who grew up when I did, you can remember when our parks had bandstands and the bands playing. You had the festivals, the Rose Queen, you had boating lakes. This is one little example. You had cafes. And now the working people deserve this. We're supposed to be in a richer society, and yet the 60s looks like a golden age of provision. And that's just one example. You could take any public service. For 12 years, these cuts have been grinding away, and we've always been told, well, the commissioners might come in. Well, we've got the commissioners, so then we're told the commissioners might extend their remit. This doesn't wash anymore. And I think what it does as well, it rots and corrodes Labour's electoral base. So when you take a look at the kind of vote, I mean, Tim Jeeves, great friend of mine, sadly passed away. He got 86% in Club Moor a couple of years ago. The vote was down to the low 50s in the recent by-election. And that a lot of that is because Labour support just drained away into passivity. If people want to see the Lib Dems, who were responsible for the worst council in Britain and propped up the Tories, if you want to see them back, then demoralise Labour voters and let them drift off. You know, I just think it's a catastrophe if we don't start. Last thing I want to say is, we had an active membership of over 500,000 people in Walton. We had stirring meetings of over 100 regularly. And we were sending people out every week, 30, 40 people out campaigning every week. And they were fired by enthusiasm. We got 84 and 85% for Dan Carden. It was that sort of enthusiasm is destroyed when you keep implementing cuts. At some point, you've got to say there's a different way. And what really gets me is twice within 4 years, Liverpool Walton CLP resolutions to have a campaign against the cuts were voted through unanimously at the regional conference, and then nothing was done about it. You can't put the blame on the Tories for cutting 450 million quid over a decade through austerity from our budgets to the detriment of our people, and not put the blame on them. And the way you put the blame on them is mass leafleting, and that should have been part of a campaign along with think tanks about how we get a budget that is no cuts and socially responsible and based on investment. And that would have been a real strategy in it, if you want. If we do if I end up in the same group as Anna, and it looks extremely likely, I think one of the things we have to explore is trying to have a conference or a think tank that spends a year drawing up an absolutely convincing watertight no-cuts budget.
Yes, and I mean, Alfie Hinks, councillor who you mentioned earlier on, and he's one of the councillors that signed the statement saying he's going to vote against these cuts. He's come up there in the comments pointing out, so the £11.7 million of cuts in adult social care is the biggest single cut, but he also points out that there's a budgeted increase up to 10 million in reserves, and we've got massive poverty in the city and massive cuts, and yet they're looking to bump up money that's just going to sit there for a rainy day and not get used. Well, if now is not a rainy day, then when is?
Right, just coming on, we questioned that at the Select Committee, and we were told that SIPFA says it is recommended that you have those level of reserves. Now, that's a recommendation. You know, it's not by law you've got to. And I think when you face damaging cuts like this, you've got to say sometimes you will take a financial risk. There are £30.7 million in reserves. I think it's quite legitimate to say we could have got through with £20.7 million. Let's take the risk, and that £10 million can actually protect our people.
Yes, and I mean, in the end, if the reserves are for anything, well, surely they've got to be for senior through times like this. Sorry, Gemma, was that you trying to come in?
Yeah. I was just going to say. I mean, there's only so much you can cut before you run out of things to cut. It's a self-defeating strategy. You know, I'm the outsider looking in here. I'm up against three people from the Liverpool area here. But this budget, I mean, £25 million in cuts, green bin charges, libraries being hit, council tax being hiked to the maximum allowable, bidding for funding for services, cuts to one-stop shops. What Alfie Hinks was just saying about 11.7 million in cuts to adult social care. As somebody who has a Tory council, this is a Tory budget. There's no two ways about it. There's no difference between what is going on here and exactly the same sort of policies that they're pushing and advocating in Cornwall. Even running big reserves as well. It serves no purpose whatsoever. I know you said a moment ago we'll spend a year trying to come up with an alternative budget, putting forward an alternative sort of a position. So this might be somewhat unfair, but given what the budget is looking like it's going to be like, what would you guys do instead? Just off the top of your heads, what would be the biggest things, or one or two things you can think of that you absolutely would do instead of this?
Well, if I do one, it'd be investment. I mean, that you actually spend on having a taxi service, so you cut down on the amount of money for kids in care, ferrying around the city. If there's access, you actually start to deliver shoppers and people in need around. Build new sports centres out of your capital budget so that you're not pouring into a black hole of a rotting building. I mean, they're just a couple of suggestions, but that general kind of approach. Now, what's interesting is when we put these forward, they said, not this year, the Cabinet very often said. That does mean that you say, okay, for next year, we actually have to be looking at that sort of investment. We have to be looking at the resources that we've got in order to protect working class people in this city and give them the sort of services that they deserve. You take a look at our sports centres, you go into Everton Park, despite the talent of the staff and everything, it's an aging building, it's cold, and when I look at some of the when I go to places like Finland and Sweden and Germany and Switzerland, and to be honest, lots of the Middle East, and I see sports centres that are actually state of the art, I'm thinking, why not us? We're the 5th richest country in the world. Now, part of it's the Tories, but part of it, as you said, if you pass on Tory cuts, you start to look like what you have been, forced to cut by. That's the reality.
Yeah.
And you mentioned dividends. What's that about dividends in the city?
Sorry, just repeat that, Steve.
You mentioned earlier on the dividends in the city or something. So
Yeah, I mean, we had an invest to save strategy, because I mean, this is 10 years of cuts, as we know, from when we took leadership in the city. So this isn't nothing new. But what it was new is that we knew that we'd get to a day when we'd say no more cuts. We had to invest to save in order to be in that position. And the reality is that we've got money. I mean, we bought the Cunard for £20 million. What's that worth now? About 50 million. We could wipe out any budget cuts by, relocating staff, selling off the building and relocating to, one of the other venues that we actually own. We've got things like Finch Farm, we've got dividends even in the airport, in John Lennon Airport. There's money there that can be freed up so that we don't have to make any cuts in this city. But this constant refusal, this argument, and saying let's put it off to next year, it's ridiculous because we don't need to implement any cuts. So this is a political choice by the Tories. They want to force us into a position where we put the people of our city under more pressure and increased hardship when we don't have to do that. One way of saving £10 million instantly and chuck that in the reserve is getting rid of the commissioners. I've been very vocal about the commissioners' fees that have been charged. Recently, they've had an increase, a 50% increase in salary, backdated to July. There's a reserve of £10 million, but then to exercise a best value initiative. And they're looking at willy-nilly increasing amounts for people who are working maybe 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day. Then that's got it's increased with expenses for travel, but hotel accommodation. You would think that the very people who've been given the task of doing a best value exercise would start doing some best value on their own predicament instead of asking. I mean, I think it's insane at a time when our city is really struggling. We've got children going to school with no breakfast, going hungry. We've had a rise in children with no beds, bed bugs. We're going back to some kind of Dickensian Britain. And the Tories' response to that is let's increase our salary by 50%. And on top of that, let's backdate it. So there are options there. And this narrative that's being pushed that we're trying to set in the legal budget, everything that's been put forward to the Labour Party and to the commissioners is being well thought out. It's based on money that we've already got in the city that we've invested in for such a day like today, like a rainy day. And they've just said, we'll do that next year. And to add the insult of saying we've got to have £10 million reserve. I mean, Manchester and Birmingham don't even have that. To take us.
Well, it's. I mean, let's just come back to what you said there as well, just in case people didn't pick that up. But the ring-fenced budget for the commissioners, and their policy assistants, even though they're supposed to be policy experts, and they shouldn't presumably need people to help them write a policy, is £10 million. So we're talking about 11 point something million pounds being cut from adult social care, and £10 million being allocated to 3 people.
Well, it's
including the 50 and 3 people plus their assistants, plus.
Yeah.
So they just and their assistants on that, to help them do this job of cutting services for poor people. I mean, that's absolutely astonishing.
Nobody knows what they're doing because, we don't get no feedback. As elected members, we can't scrutinise them. We don't know what they're doing from month to month. It's not trickling down to elected members, whether it be Labour elected members or independents like myself. I mean, I really don't know what they're doing for that cash. The scenario where they advertise for a policy officer is ridiculous because the thing that they're claiming that warrants this high daily rate is that they're leaders in their field in terms of policy. Yet they need to employ a policy officer. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And their brief has extended beyond those original 3 departments that they were meant to investigate. I think one of the other things that we have to say is take a look at this in terms of the Labour Party, policing and disciplining its members. The people who had the most to do with the deficiencies were people at the top in the council. Now, we don't know who they are. We have not had any real transparency. Nobody's been brought to book. And then you say, okay, when it came to the Hanson report, who were the people put most under scrutiny? It was constituency Labour parties who had had the least to do with it. Our members knew there was something wrong. You know, everybody in the city did. We didn't know what, because we're rank and file activists down at the ground. And that kind of upside down authoritarianism for the individual Labour Party member who goes out and knocks on doors, does the work, and a strange reluctance to bring to book the people at the top. You know, MPs that misbehave, like Neil Coyle. You know, it wasn't the first time when he'd insulted people. He'd been doing it year after year after year, absolutely abusive to Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader. And this kind of inequity helps to police the membership, and that means that rank and file councillors feel cowed and stop speaking out. And if you've got that policing at the same time as, well, we've done it for 10 years, we've done it for 12 years, we've done it for 40 years, for God's sake. And I can remember when there were 20 odd Labour councillors in the 80s who were going to fight, and then it slowly bled away. That was when David Blunkett was supposed to be red. I've got a very long memory, I'll tell you. And it ended up with just Lambeth and Liverpool, and then eventually it ended up with Liverpool. And that is phenomenally demoralising as a Labour Party member, to be continually policed, to be spied on for your social media. And I mean, I was a teacher, primary teacher, and what you always did, if somebody made a slight transgression, you all said, have a chat, you know, let's have a look at the behaviour. Let's, you know, where was this? Immediate expulsion, immediate suspensions of people for incredibly trivial things, you know, say swearing when he said, like, the Foo Fighters. And all of this fog contributes to cowing an active membership, both rank and file members and councillors. And one thing that disturbs me is when we were having, you know, what they called online meetings like this, the number of people who just sat there with the cameras off listening. You know, every single Labour group ought to be, you know, a ferment of debate, but it becomes more and more passive all the time, with the officers and the cabinets dictating things, and people feeling they don't have the information to democratically argue back.
Yes. No. So just to kind of underline that, the point on that though, there, you know, this again from Alfie, there was the alternative budget that was presented to the leadership that would help this lunacy, as he's called it, and they rejected that. So they've had an alternative plan put to them that wouldn't require all the cuts. He also points out that with interest rates at an all-time low and borrowing down, you could borrow to invest, and then invest and save money in the way that, you know, we have some potential benefit from already from stuff that's been done in the past.
We wrote, just one thing, we wrote letter after letter, you know, asking for those, you know, proposals to be rigorously scrutinised, and it was delayed and delayed. And the councillors who were putting forward these ideas were never given a platform at Labour Group to actually systematically set out their stall. And yet 4 or 5 times the same cabinet proposals were laid out. Again, there's this inequity. I mean, I think every idea, if you're serious that you're under financial pressure, every idea should be systematically debated and scrutinised. If you're really desperate, and I'll tell you one thing we've got to remove from the Labour movement vocabulary is no member of the Labour Party should ever say tough choices. We're facing tough choices. We're not facing tough choices.
Exactly. I'll agree with you on that. And I'm just going to pause you because we're going to lose Anna in a minute. So I want to give her a last word before she has to move on. So Anna, what do you want to bring in? I mean, you know, there's aspects I wanted to get on about the, you know, Keir Starmer, as far as I can see, declaring war on the city. So I don't know if you want to say anything on that, given that you left the party and discussed it the way others have
just
themselves.
Very mindful of the political environment, because we're moving almost towards a dictatorship. I mean, the treatment of elected members is absolutely appalling. The levels that people are prepared to go to silence and halt discussion and debate I've never seen it in my lifetime. And you know, it really is a big issue, and we're going to lose more and more members. We've lost thousands already. I had to sit through one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had to sit through as a Labour councillor, when 2 Labour women, by the way, excuse me, were disciplined because of something that they'd done that should have been encouraged. It was open and honest and frank debate, but instead they were disciplined, and it was done on a Zoom meeting, on a Zoom call. And with Zooms, you have to be really mindful, because you're going into people's safe spaces, you're going into people's homes. And I was ashamed. I had to turn the camera off. It made me cry, the fact that I was actually being part of a kangaroo course where 2 women, strong Labour women who fought passionately for the people of this city, were being treated with such disrespect that it was fun. And that was one of the deciding factors for me to say I can't belong to this party, because if this is the depths that the party's sunk to, and it certainly is, then really it doesn't sit with my ethos or my values, and I can't be part of it. And so this is one argument in a long list of arguments that we're going to be having as elected members. This is about the cuts, and this is something that's facing us immediately. I mean, we're meeting on Wednesday, but we also have to look at things in the round, and look at what else is coming down the track at us. And what is coming down the track of us is a complete change in politics. The political environment will change overnight. And we have to look at our alternative, because this 2-party politics that we've been so used to is not working. It doesn't represent a working man and woman. It doesn't represent our most vulnerable in the city. It certainly does not represent or respect human rights or children or any of the groups that are vulnerable. And we have to sit down and stare ourselves in the face and say, is this something we want to be party to? Or do we want to be part of a new movement that does take us back to the values and principles of old Labour? Because this party does not have any of those values or principles, and anybody with eyes can see that. People are going to struggle. This big discussion we're having about the cuts and about the council meeting. This is because people cannot honestly and openly discuss the issues. I mean, during the 97, setting legal budgets, etc., we were faced with, Whitehall coming into the city and running the council. We don't have the same, we're not facing the same thing today, because they're already here and they're already running our council. They've sent commissioners in, they're covering outside of the lines. They're not just sticking to the specific remits that they were sent here. They're literally running the system into the ground. And, anyone who's got eyes can see that. And I, for one, I'm not going to stand back and be silenced on those issues. And so I will be very vocal at the full council meeting, which was one of the primary reasons why I went independent. At the time I went independent, because I'm not playing this game. Unfortunately, I'm being subjected to a disciplinary letter or a suspension or the removal of the. I knew that was coming, and I was not going to be playing that game. Because the life of our citizens, our residents, our children is far too important for us to be politically posturing and playing games within the party. They will sit in the back seat of it, and I must say so am I. And on that note, I'll leave you there, because I have to pop into it. But we'll wait and see what happens on Wednesday. I think people are waiting with bated breath to see the outcome of that. But the one short of that is that they are going to assess the budget that's going to impact on thousands of people in this city.
Thanks for that, and good luck with whatever it is you're doing next. I know we're losing you now, but I really appreciate your time being on. And good luck. Well, we've lost her already. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comment here from Mark Lungley saying, I'm reminded what Howard Beckett said once: if you behave like a Tory and act like a Tory, we'll treat you as Tories. Perhaps the socialists need to do this in this situation in Liverpool. So, I mean, Alan, I'll understand if you feel you can't comment on that while you're still suspended, at least Labour member. But, Keir Starmer and his attack on Liverpool, because I write Skwawk books, for those who don't know, and I've been writing for months now that Keir Starmer has set his sights on Liverpool and has actually declared war on the city. We've seen We saw the interference in the mayoral selection for the Labour candidate, which ended up with, the prelude to Anna leaving the party, who's just left the programme now, with her and 2 other women candidates summarily deselected without the party even bothering to give an explanation until well after the fact. And that explanation didn't really stand up. One of the things that they used against Anna as a reason for taking her off the list of candidates was when she said in a Zoom meeting that she would stand up and sort out corruption. So, wanting to sort out corruption helped to get her kicked off the ticket, so that the members in Liverpool couldn't choose the candidate that they wanted, and then have 2 others foisted on them with no choice in the matter. We've seen a string of front benchers, and then ultimately Keir Starmer himself writing for the Murdoch rag that around here is often called the scum, and caused horror in the city. And when people reacted and were horrified, he said he would do it again. And we've seen the suspension of members. We've seen suspensions of CLPs. We've seen the appointment of a woman as the Liverpool officer, whatever that means, for the regional party, obviously in the city, who left the Labour Party to campaign for the Change UK / Funny Tinge Party, as we all call them. And now she's running the city for the Labour Party, etc. Is it a war? Have they declared war? Is this part of is this whole thing of welcoming the commissioners and setting this budget? Is that all part of the attempt to break the most left and the most active activist socialist city in England, at least, if not the UK? If not, what the hell is he doing? And what's the mayor doing? Why do we need a mayor if the mayor's not going to stand up against it and just go along with it?
The way I put it is, there's an old adage that you never let a good crisis pass without taking advantage of it. And I think that's precisely what Starmer did. I mean, we all know that the Collar report has genuinely highlighted deficiencies that need addressing. And, poor service and possible corruption should actually go without people who are instrumental in making that happen being called to account and potentially facing legal sanctions. This has got to be resolved, or the city has this whiff hanging around it. But as I said before, the people who've been most scrutinised have not been the people most likely to have caused those problems. That's what's a scandal. And that's against the context that Keir Starmer won that election on those 10 pledges, and infamously, every single one of them has been backtracked. As I said before, I was suspended at one point. Loads of my friends have actually faced suspension, or threats of suspension have meant they just threw their hand in and walked away. There's still more socialists in the Labour Party than there are outside it. And, it is still an entirely legitimate thing to fight for a future mass democratic socialist party within it. The other thing, and there's a couple of things recently that you didn't mention, the censoring of 11 MPs who signed a Stop the War statement because they dared to criticise NATO. I mean, anybody who lived through the years of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, knows that NATO is not a friend to the Ukrainian people. That's the reality. The censoring of Young Labour, the most vibrant section, the future of the Labour Party. And this, I was going to say this can't go on. This is most likely to go on. And I suspect the result of it is going to be a competition. Who is going to throw the next election most effectively? A Labour Party that demoralises its own left wing, or a Tory party that's crashing and burning with its anus on fire? I mean, it's a competition. It's a race to the bottom between the two. I mean, honest to God, if you want to make sure we get a Labour government, however weak it might be under Keir Starmer, send Liz Truss onto the doorstep. And when people hear that baritone voice creaking at you, you'd vote for anything but the Tories, But
the thing is, though, that sort of raises the question, because we are seeing Boris Johnson with his pants on fire. We're seeing We've seen the Tory party that ought to be, running at 0% in the polls, and Labour Party romping ahead. And we were promised anybody but Jeremy Corbyn, and Labour would be 20 points ahead. And the polls are weird polls, but every time there's an actual poll where people got the ballot box and put their votes in the box, Labour's absolutely crashing and burning. So how on earth you can not be beating a party that has frankly murdered, getting on for 200,000 people in the past couple of years in its handling of the pandemic, and knowingly done so, not by accident, is astonishing. And yet we're seeing them, apparently trying to kind of drive out even more support, bankrupt themselves politically as well as financially. We've seen this attack on young Labour, and you're talking about authoritarian, and we've seen the party this week seized control, or just last week, seized control of the Young Labour social media accounts for daring to be critical. And I mean, it's simple fact. I mean, the WikiLeaks released a cable from 2014, I think it was, by the guy who was then the ambassador for America to the Ukraine and is now running the Central Intelligence Agency, saying that there would be consequences if NATO kept making moves towards bringing Ukraine into NATO. So I'm no fan of any of those people, and I don't think there's any good actors going on at the moment. But they were making a perfectly valid opinion about the facts at hand, and the Labour Party called them selfish and said that wasn't, we're not going to put it with this selfishness that isn't dedicated solely to getting to winning the next election. And yet the Labour Party itself, under Keir Starmer, shows absolutely zero sign, as far as I could see, of actually wanting to win the next election. They're just using all that as an excuse to try and consolidate their power base within the party and stuff the next election and the one after that. They don't care as long as they keep their control in the party. They frankly don't seem to give a stuff where they ever get in the government.
Yeah. I think most of all, we desperately need a positive agenda. And the positive agenda for me is not Wes Streeting wearing his dad's posh overcoat and standing between two flags, looking serious. I mean, it's got to be, people have mentioned in the chat, it is public ownership. I mean, we've by us, we've got the County Road. It's the most historic thoroughfare in Liverpool. It's the main traffic direction into town from the north end, and it's been a mess for months. And the reason it's been a mess for months is that a contractor collapsed. We ought to be really working our guts out to try and bring these services in-house. And that parallels that public ownership should be the absolute dominant issue for the public. You say you've got a cost of living crisis. Why in France have they got a relatively small rise in the cost of living? And here we've got a runaway cost of living. Take a look at the profits of the private energy companies. We can change things. People somehow have, over years since Thatcher, have been atomized and made to feel there's nothing you can do collectively. For a brief period in 2017, people began to dream. And you saw 3.5 million people flock to the Labour banner. The next election, we could have actually won. Absolutely convinced of it. But when Alex Nunn's book comes out, Sabotage, and when finally, I hope I live long enough, the Ford report emerges, we will know the depth and extent of the sabotage that was committed against an honest leader, who was trying to put transformative politics. And that brings us back to the council. If there's nothing transformative about the message that councillors are putting forward, what somebody asked before, if we replicate Tories, you look from man to pig and from pig to man, and you can't tell the difference. We make ourselves in the Tory image by implementing Tory policies. And the novel you need to read on that is Fame is the Spur by Howard Spring, when he says, if I just stick with the system long enough, one day I'll pull out the Peterloo sword and I'll fight. And it comes to the point where he's desperate to fight and he pulls, and it's been in the scabbard so long it's rusted in and will not emerge. That's what I'm terrified of. That we don't need to be hammered, if you want, by the state or by the right wing, you know, by the Tories. But we've made ourselves unambitious and small-minded, and we don't believe in anything anymore. If you stop believing in anything, you can't look yourself in the mirror. Simple as.
We've had a comment in here from Alan saying, is an independent Labour group forming in the not too distant future? Might go on to include other boroughs of Merseyside if the attacks on socialists continue. It does raise a question in my mind. I mean, is it, you know, we've seen that, you know, we know the issues where any new party forming, any new group forming is going to face an uphill struggle with the way that things are. But, you know, there has to be some kind of alternative. And at the moment, you know, it's the two cheeks of the same arse argument really with the Labour Party and the Conservatives under their current leadership. Could it be that they pushed too hard in Liverpool and you know, Keir Starmer's waging war on the city trying to break the left? Could it be that you know that provides a spark that's going to spread to other places, and resistance among councillors in Liverpool, please God, might spread to other places as well, and we actually get, you know, some real socialists standing up and you know, putting themselves on the line for the people that they're serving.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say, I mean, almost certainly this is going to lead to the emergence of an independent socialist group of councillors. Not the choice of all of us, you know. I mean, I don't believe in the whipping system. I believe there's always room for a vote of conscience. I think the only discipline worthwhile is the discipline of the football field, the discipline of people who gang together for something they love and have a common aspiration. And that's real discipline. It comes from within. It comes from your friends. Discipline that's imposed on you, that demoralizes. You're being told to vote for something you don't believe in. And in local government, it's extremely strict. There isn't a first, second and third line whip. Essentially, you know, you might get away with it once, you won't get away with it twice. It's much stricter than on MPs, you know. And so, I mean, a group will emerge, and it will have to examine what are the possibilities and what alliances are made. And I'm not going to make predictions now, because I mean, I've only just, you know, been suspended from the Labour Party. I would dearly love to have stayed in the Labour Party and learn from the things that we did wrong under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And there were plenty, you know, open selection, not being voted through. I don't want us to ever be as rude and as nasty and dishonest as the right wing were with us, but I think we needed to be much more rigorous and much less soft-hearted than we were. We reached out to people who had a knife behind their backs, and we've got to learn these sort of lessons. We've got to be intellectually and morally tough for the future. And as I said before, I'm not going to instantly say which is the way forward. I mean, I think it was Tolstoy said, grey is theory, but green is the tree of life. We'll learn through experience. We're in a relatively new place. There will be a socialist group in on Liverpool City Council, separate from the Labour Party, because people don't want to leave their party. I mean, I put 6 years of my life in it. Every waking moment almost when I was CLP secretary, it's the most consuming thing you can do. It's hard to step aside from that, and some people won't. And the one thing I will say is, on the way in to the vote, there will be damn good people on the Labour benches that will think the only thing that can rescue us is a Labour government, and please don't abuse them, you know, anybody. But I think what I'd say to those people is examine your conscience. If you're waiting for Godot, take a look at who Godot is. If you believe that Rachel Reeves trying to bring in fiscal responsibility the way Gordon Brown did for 2 years at the start of the Blair era is actually going to rescue local government, well, let's just say I'm sceptical.
Yes, the idea that Starmer would be any better than what we've got, you know, he might dress it up a bit nicer and throw the odd sweetie in people's directions to con them into putting up with stuff while he gets on with it. But you know, I don't think there's any substantive difference. But I think that he and his crew are substantially to the right of some of the people on the Tory benches at the minute, and that's a frightening thought. And we're getting in the last 5 minutes. Let's kind of throw the books wide open, and not just on this topic, Alan, but is there anything else you want to talk about for the last 5 minutes, just to get a message across to people? Any last words?
I'll tell you what I will talk about. I mean, all of this is dwarfed by what's happening to the people of Ukraine. Several times in my life, Grozny, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968. We have seen either Stalinism or a right-wing authoritarian like Putin entering a country and leading to the deaths of its citizens. So it's solidarity to the people of Ukraine fighting back. Absolute solidarity to one of the most inspirational things, which is the peace movement in Russia. And we need to show the same courage and the same enthusiasm. There's a vigil being called tomorrow night at I think 6 o'clock at the bombed out church in Liverpool for Ukraine. And the final thing on that, I'd say to anybody who has illusions that the West, the leaders we've got in the West now, can be enemies of us over the NHS, enemies over us to us of local government, but friends over Ukraine, don't believe it. Boris Johnson played tennis with a former Putin minister's wife for 160 grand. He put Lebedev, whose dad was a KGB general, and somebody in favour of annexing Crimea, put him in and made him Baron Lebedev, went to his castle in Italy and came staggering out at the airport rotten drunk. Remember this. Remember that a quarter of the Tory cabinet took money from oligarchs. They are not friends of the Ukrainian people, and they would dump you. We've got to remember this. You've got to, hold your friends close and hold your enemies closer, because their record in Libya and in Afghanistan and in Iraq is catastrophic.
Well, it's worth pointing out while you're on that topic that the Keir Starmer has a number of advisors, notably Peter Mandelson, with extensive links with Russia, and it was one of the other ones as well. I can't forget which one. Was going out to kind of make in fact, there's people with business links in Russia who have made extensive donation to his campaign, as I understand it.
He's got
to get himself elected as the leader. So he's not in a position to throw any stones in a glass house, that fella. So, sadly, we're seeing this kind of posturing going on at the minute, where ordinary people get the shitty end of the stick, as ever, as you've mentioned, in Ukraine and so on, and in Russia as well, anybody who's standing up to protest, while the elites, so-called, get on with it and do their own thing for whatever their own agendas are. And that's it's a perennial thing, but it doesn't make it any less disgusting for the fact that it's always there.
Yeah, we ought to be expropriating the oligarch's house and renting them out and giving the money to refugees. And the last thing I've got to say as well is the Tories still are not waiving, the visa requirements.
Yes.
We should be saying anybody fleeing oppression in Ukraine and from any other similar conflict should be able to come to this country. They always boast about the kinder transport. The likes of the Daily Mail didn't want the kinder transport children to come to this country. We have got to be welcoming. It's always the left that holds out a hand of solidarity, always.
Yes, and I mean, there has been that, extensive racism across the media as well, where they say, well, surely we've got to do something to help, because these people are blue-eyed and white-skinned like us, essentially, the idea that you're more, you're less worthy of help in tough situations if you've got brown or black skin, etc., is just disgusting. But we've also seen Priti Patel. Essentially, there's a cartoon today, but it was really barely funny, because it was only it's too true. But shouting up to somebody in a burning building, waving a Ukrainian flag and saying, "But are you willing to pick vegetables?" That they're prepared to let people in if they're going to come here and do some poorly paid job. That we need people in at the minute, but that's not what you do when somebody's house is on fire.
They never imagine a refugee can be a lawyer, a doctor, a surgeon, a scientist. They never imagine that any refugee can be the equal of any of us. And actually, loads of the refugees I met were exactly that. I mean, and they're talking about Ukrainian refugees being allowed to work, interestingly, today. Why are they not affording that to every refugee?
Yes.
From Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, Eritrea, wherever they come from, these people have got talents. They should all be allowed to work the moment they come here, not to live in this demi-monde of having vouchers for the supermarket.
Well, my daughter, I'll just finish on the point. My daughter's friends with a refugee from Azerbaijan, who is a qualified nurse, and look how short we are of nurses, and yet they're in the final appeal now to try to get to be allowed to stay in this country because the government keeps wanting to kick them out, in spite of the threat to their lives, etc. So, you know, this is the situation that we're in. We have a racist government. We sadly have an opposition party, so-called, that thinks it needs to be more racist in order to compete. And you know, we've seen what happens with that when we had the you know, I'll be tougher on benefit claimants than the Tories. I mean, that didn't work out well. Guys, we are at the end of the show. Thank you ever so much for your time. If you've been watching us live or watching it on catch up, thank you for that as well. Thank you to Anna, who's not here now but was here for a good part of the show as well. And best of luck to everybody. Complete solidarity with everyone who's standing up for principle and for people. And Alan, you'll be welcome on any time. And we look forward to developments as they go on this week. So thanks a lot, everybody. Watch out, LJ. We'll just quick plug. On Thursday, we have Alexi Sale and Paul Heron talking about spy cops and the government's legislation and the kind of racist, I was going to say drift, but that's not the word, in society. And then next week, we'll be talking to a couple of candidates for positions in the Labour Party, elected positions on behalf of members, but also talking about the Coventry bin strike as well. So that's a week from tonight. See you soon, everybody, and thank you for your time. Take care.
Thanks a lot.